But if you turn those satellites upside down and point them into the sky, that's somebody else. Even though they're all low Earth orbiting satellites, very similar. So even within Goddard, we know a lot about mission operations. We have multiple groups that have long histories, very proud of what they do, very successful at it. So you can see what the group kind of figured out is, so then they said, how do you guys collaborate? How do you share? Part of my job is to help that locally within Goddard, but within other centers, it really is just smart people that happen to meet each other at conferences. And out of that, hey, let's call each other when there's issues, or happen from past lives, had interactions with folks. That's where we are now. We don't have a cross-cutting approach yet across our 10 centers that are all successful at mission operations. So let alone before we can just jump to the solutions we're talking about, Frank, we don't even have somebody that can tell these people to go talk to each other.
That's my job.
So you're one step ahead of us. So what this group is doing, they're supposed to recommend new policy to the NASA administrator this fall about the first steps. And it's hard. Do you just say, by definition, we need to appoint a leader, that can sit up at NASA headquarters and tell people to talk to each other? Is that going to be the solution? But we're not clear yet even what is the solution to get to where we're all even talking on the same page, let alone looking towards the common solutions. So it's interesting on the culture. We do have 10 cultures in mission ops. They're all proud of what they do. But we got a ways to go before the leadership flows into all that kind of, because of the way we're structured.
Ma'am?
So bizarrely enough, even with, so Google's around 60,000 employees, and there are several different groups that are operating vehicles that collect data. So we've got Skybox, and then you might be familiar with the Street View cars, which are going around mapping things. And in many instances, these different groups have telemetry that need to be displayed and anomalies that need to be handled and things that need to be scheduled. And yet, similar to what Dan just said, these are in very different organizations with different leaders, with their own operations centers. And so there's no one person anywhere who can say, okay, put the Street View people together with the Skybox people, even though in that particular situation, we're actually in the same product area. So we should have some incentive to do that. So the way that that I'm hoping that we'll be able to address that problem, and of course, Skybox does it best, so we will be spreading our technology to everyone else, is by getting people together and talking, recognizing what the common problems are. And at least in this case, Google does have a strong culture of trying to reach common solutions, and there's a little bit more incentive. There might be a little bit more incentive to do that. The other thing is that going back to the contracting process, although we don't have contracts with each other, Google's incentive and promotion process is very much focused around, as you move up the ladder, the influence that you can spread to other teams and bring teams across Google together. And so I expect, or I hope to leverage some of people's personal interests in collaboration in order to be promoted to help solve some of that siloing problem within our company as opposed to all the federal government.
I'd like to ask a little bit of a follow-on question. It's about culture, but it kind of turns it toward more the new talent that's coming in from schools or into the industry, and I think I'll ask you to talk to this first. John, in light of the consensus that culture is the most difficult aspect to change the ground systems and perhaps the future of space in general, what advice would you give to either young government and or young industry employees involved in space at the beginning of their careers, and what would folks that are maybe just starting in on that process, could they do to help enable a brighter future? So maybe we'll start with you, John.
Sure. I was suspiciously silent last time because in the university setting, we don't really have as much of a cultural problem, right? We don't have students in our lab who have been there for 8, 10, 20 years doing the same thing, right? So we don't have the pre-established cultural problem. We actually have the other problem, right? The students are so used to new technology, they go out and repeat all the same mistakes again and again and again, right? So in answer to the question, we try to strike a balance, right? We try to encourage the students to go out and learn and research and look at the papers and try to figure out what else has been done, talk to other people. But at the same time, we also tell them it's okay if you think you have a different way to do it, absolutely try it. We'll, prototype it, we'll do whatever. And if it fails, that's fine, right? That's what our environment in the lab can handle. And obviously that's not the perfect solution for every organization because there's more performance expectations depending on where you are in your job. But within the university and within our lab, that's one of the things that we try to do. We try to encourage both going out and learning from the information that's available and talking to other people at other universities who are trying to do similar things, collaborating with them, and then encouraging them if they have great ideas or they think they have great ideas to go ahead and explore them, and let's decide if it really is a good idea and it's something that we're going to pursue and push, or we're going to have to look somewhere else.
Matt, will you follow up on that too? Because I think, you have probably quite a few early career professionals. Certainly Google does, and I think even Skybox in terms of the kind of being the new kid on the block. So, any advice you might give to folks that are, starting down this career, and how could they be enablers of changing the culture?
So I guess being relatively early in my career myself, I guess compared to many of the people here, it's odd for me to be offering that advice. But I guess to John's point maybe is to actually make sure that you are speaking up. I think in many instances new folks particularly can be intimidated either by the people around them or by the established ways. So that certainly isn't the case in the university or may not be the case in the university, but in sort of larger companies that might be the case. So making sure that there is a culture of allowing people to speak up, make mistakes, and realizing that they may not know everything that you've experienced in the past 30 years. When I was on the flight software team at Skybox, the flight software lead had actually had something like 20 years and several missions under his belt. But the way he went about having us develop the software, and we were a team of several people with either no or very little aerospace experience, is he would provide guidance, but we came up with, this was not on the ground software side, but we came up with the requirements docs, we came up with the functional specifications, we went through the reviews, and so even though he had a vision of where he wanted things to go, at least ostensibly, we were coming up with the ideas and then sort of being guided down some conservative paths in some cases, and then hopefully he learned something from us along the way. So I guess fostering young people and encouraging them to contribute, and then those people not being afraid to speak their mind.
Great, thank you. We had a question for Miguel related to what civilian space agencies might be able to learn from the Eutelsat concept of operations and cost reductions in the ground segment. And we're always very interested in that, hear lots of success stories. So any words of wisdom there that you could share?
Thank you. Yes, maybe in relation with what has just been said, and maybe this word of you call culture, or in other contexts I have noted that as enterprise. In our case, this is called what we call the operational philosophy, and that translates into things that we believe are important and other that are less important. Things that we believe important is, for instance, that the operators, the engineers, are always aware of what's going on. So, for instance, we stop at automation, system automations, whenever we believe that maybe the man is going to lose control. So, and I think that helps. That's important, and maybe related with also the room we give to evolve our systems. So, for us, that's important. And then, in connection with the cost reductions or reducing also the complexity, I think it's very important we master the evolution process. So that we master all the information that needs to be known in order to decide how the system will evolve. For instance, we have been, or in some of the discussions, it has been addressed the need for open systems, open source. For those that are core business systems, we do require ourselves to master all the resources associated to those. So it means that this permits to decide how the systems will evolve, and also, and more important, it permits to establish competition. So it means that for major evolutions of our systems, you are in a position to ask for several bidders to explain to you how this can be implemented. So, and you don't get tied to a particular contractor to permit for your systems to evolve. And then I would say the third important point is to always have in mind that whenever you're going to make an evolution of your system, that system is going to be changed also in the future. So it's kind of designed for change. Design any of your facilities, resources, systems, so that for sure that can be changed later on. So for me, these are the three important items to consider to make yourself effective over the long term. I don't know if I have answered the question. Thank you.
No, absolutely. Thank you. Very good. I'd like to turn a little bit to another area, but again related to, with the theme of common services, and, we heard a lot of talks about interoperability, and of course, there's kind of this, dual side related to it that you're always balancing in terms of the, the benefits you get from interoperability and how that really helps your systems, and then of course the whole cybersecurity things that are brought up, and it seems like there's always kind of this, grand tension between those. So I'd like for some of the panelists to address, are cyber concerns a major roadblock to interoperability? And, is there, some way in terms of being able to be successful in terms of going down interoperability and also addressing security? And then it also relates to a comment that Mr. Konechny made earlier, where he was talking about JIE providing this single security architecture for standardization, but then when you standardize on something, does that make it easier then to have an attack against that system? So kind of the whole area of cybersecurity. If someone would like to address that.
Okay, I think I'll start with that one. You might say, well, golly, how come he's addressing cybersecurity? Because, do people at the university really care? And so we've actually gone through, we recently re-architected our ground station network, and one of the things that we've been pushing for those involved is separating out very distinctly the policy from sort of the mechanism or the technology we're using to enforce the policy, right? And we have found that from a technology standpoint, you can be relatively secure, you can be very secure, you can be standards compliant, and you can give the individual tracking stations, the individual mission operators, the ability at a policy level to say, hey, look, I want to use this station, I'm going to allow this particular station to talk to my satellite, right? And that making a big effort and push to separate the two gives you a lot more flexibility long term. You're talking about sort of the emergency operations. Say, look, I actually need a station over in Europe to talk to my satellite because something's going wrong. Normally we wouldn't permit this, but golly, at a policy level, we can express this very quickly and allow this pre-existing mechanism or the pre-existing technology to work, right? And that's one of the things that we've been pushing in our system. Whether or not you'd think that our technology is up to this level of security that we need for some of these, highly sensitive operations, it's sort of different. But from a design standpoint, I think separating the technology and the policy is very important to ensuring flexibility long term.
Go ahead.
Okay, let's talk about some things. Interoperability is kind of interesting because it it talks about, let's talk about data interoperability, moving data between each other, moving data between different devices or commands between different devices and different sessions and things. The first thing that we put in the security architecture was the dynamic ABAC controls to make sure that the user community has only certain roles and responsibilities. You heard about that in the conference today, too. That we want to make sure that we gear down the ability to do things based upon the particular role of the person and where that person exists and is. Secondly, at the same time, we haven't talked about this. We have another concept, which is non-personal entity security, which means the same thing. It's box-to-box communication and credentialing between the boxes. So you will only send a certain type of information from one box to another box, and that's the only thing you can send, and that's controlled also. So to support interoperability with we call a single cybersecurity architecture now has those tenets in it, and also the tenets of what security policy I'm going to allow within in fact, the DoD domain this time, because it's the joint domain, and how you control within that domain what's really happening. And besides analytics occurring and a lot of logging and translation and everything else established with it, that's why we want to have a single security. It's single in the sense that it's understood across the board as to what is really going on. We can control what's going on. Because if you don't realize that everybody has their own security architecture. NASA has one. They don't want to admit it. But they have one. NOAA has one too. I mean, the question is, it's unique to them. In the services, there was many unique ones to them. And the problem that you always have with unique ones, you may be able to get into one of them unique ones and not notice it. And if you do that, and there's a level of trust or non-trust between different components, in that you may spread viruses across the board. When you have a single knowledgeable one that you can look at, you can see anomalies much faster, and you can respond to anomalies much faster. It's like, driving around here in LA. Can you pick out one car anywhere and try to find it? This is like our network. It's like LA. And the question you have always is, okay, how can I control and look and see if there's something anomaly someplace in that network? And it's really hard, unless it's a pure network and there's all white cars except for that red one. And you can pick it out. And that's the intent upon having that level of security, so you can pick out things that are wrong and then stop it immediately.
Very interesting. Thank you. Another area that I think always comes up when you talk about trying to move toward a goal in terms of whether it's interoperability or more common services or standardization, what type of changes do you think should be made to what we might call our existing or current traditional government procurement practices to accommodate more of these enterprise services that have been discussed, a lot here at GSAW, and are there, what would be some desired procurement changes that we'd want to make in order to accommodate some more of these agile processes, however, to still then be compliant with, acquisition rules that we currently have to operate under. So is that kind of tension there between the acquisition practices and the procurement and where we want to go. Dan?
Simple on a small scale. What we do, once you have an open framework with clear definitions of interfaces, I can recompete things yearly for small teams to develop new tools for use by lots of missions. Because they're not busy integrating between all the other components, they're developing new capabilities that interface through a standard open interface. Each year, I kind of put out a feeler, for who has some new ideas they'd like to implement. Sometimes they're half-person jobs, by somebody that has no ties to other work. We've had outside vendors come to us from other industries and say, I think my tool could help you guys. And guess what? I've kind of worked in the background to make it compliant with your open interfaces. Can we try it out? So what we're doing is kind of expanding a storefront concept, meaning my group, I don't actually deploy ground systems. I run a storefront where my job is to create a beneficial catalog for the missions to choose from. okay? And we get funding just to build the catalog and to work with these groups. And then when a mission comes along, they come to us and go shopping, okay? And if they need a COTS package, yes, they will go buy the COTS package on their own. But we've given them more options than they've ever had before because we've kind of separated out the storefront idea from the mission, development idea.
Mel, you have any thoughts on that position?
I was thinking about how could we, from an industry perspective, what incentivizes industry? What could the government do in their practices to encourage them to those commercial, non-traditional providers who may have, who I believe have some innovative solutions for the problems that they've solved. Maybe Matt can talk a little bit about, what interest Google or Skybox might have in dealing with the government, and why they don't deal with the government so well. But I think that the government needs to find out needs to understand better what is the incentive calculus that industry uses, and so maybe you could help Matt with do you guys have some kind of a calculus?
Yeah, so that's a question I need to defer. So my expertise more or less in developing the ground system. So the relationships with the government I can't really talk about. Sorry.
No, maybe Frank.
I mean, there are ways of injecting new technology. I mean, our process basically supports new technology injection, but there are ways of doing technology for people who have not been associated with the government. Our real problem is that when we write government contracts, and I hate to say this, guys, but when we give it to a system integrator, there is difficulty for anybody else except for the system integrator to do anything. And so we say, unless we direct a sub accordingly, there's no way of doing this easily. And that may be, some of the contracting issues that we have to resolve is how we're going to have new injection of technology. I mean, Dan does it year by year, which is really cool. But some of these systems we can't do it year by year, and so we get stuck in a longer time frame. But we need to figure this out. There's no way of being adaptive and agile unless we do something like that.
Yeah, I would also add that there's a balance of the government is very used to, and in fact purposely transitioned from an associate contractor environment where the government did the integration. This was about 20 years ago in the ballistic missile business, where they had associate contractors and the government was an integrator, and the government, as the integrator, had a very large organization. BMO had over 1,000 people supporting the integration of the whole Minuteman and Peacekeeper systems. But they didn't feel that was cost effective, so they transitioned away from that to the system integrator prime kind of a relationship, and that eliminated the government participation, and actually, unfortunately, in my view, eliminated some of the knowledge in the government as to how to do integration. And so I think that as we go into this new environment, where we want to encourage multiple people coming in, smaller people, and in a way I hate to say this for the big guys like Lockheed and Boeing and Raytheon, but they're really discouraging them from being, from providing those kinds of services and looking for other companies that can provide a service over a shorter period of time, deliver a service that gets put into the cloud or into the system, and then and that's it, and then they look for the next service, right? But the government doesn't really understand how to do integration well. And so I think that's another development opportunity that the government should embrace, is how do we learn how to be an integrator?
We're actually trying that with one of the HR systems right now, A1. And it's a kind of interesting contract because it has the ability to recompete pieces of it every year or so. But again, it's the problem is that the government has to learn to be an integrator again.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that just occurred to me when we were talking about this, this idea between the balance between discipline and agility is actually on the technical side a topic. And in fact, there was a session last night that talked about techniques and that balance between, agile and discipline. And so maybe there is a way to look toward some of the things that we try to solve it on a technical basis of how do you, because we know it's not all of one or the other, right? So we know there's this balance. So maybe there's something related to our technical way we solve technical problems that also could somehow be used, from a acquisition or procurement or something like that too. I mean, it just occurred to me because it's certainly something we talk about a lot in the technical domain. Sometimes in another domain, you find a solution to something to use in a different one. So.
I mean, it's very, because technically we can produce things. Now the problem is on the contractual side. When I'm doing, agile development, I may not come out with something you like. But contractually, the acquisition people say you must come out with something. It must be a deliverable because otherwise I can't measure your progress. And so I think it's a different way of measuring progress now. You have to talk about how well, and you're supposed to deliver things in increments, which is unusual for the government to grab increments, and the increments may be changed later based upon further increments. Now that's a totally different paradigm shift for the government, and again, it's cultural. So it's a difficult environment to get the acquisition people to understand that you may be getting documentation that may not be complete, and it may be wrong and changed later, but there should be something there.
Miguel, a comment?
Contribution from my side at another scale, of course, of these enormous programs you are involved in. We have in the past quite successfully promoted innovation by trying to specify not requirements or functional specifications, but more in the area of objectives, to give room for the contractors to innovate. And in some cases, very difficult because you believe to have the clear understanding of which are the constraints that the contractors need to meet. And I think it pays back making that effort to go from those specifications or constraints to a higher level, trying to specify objectives. It's not easy, but from my past experience, that fosters innovation, permits for several options to be taken, and maybe from backgrounds very different to the one we are used to. Thank you.
Thank you. There was a question that was raised actually this morning for our speaker, and I want to go back to this question and actually the comments that Mr. Peterson had made. Some presenters stated that using open source software applications instead of COTS applications is an important cost avoidance decision. So the question is, how should government ground system decision makers weigh the risk and the balance of, this for-profit software companies versus benefits of, say, saving costs with costs, but then the license costs that, the speaker was talking about this morning that really kind of caused them issues ahead of time. So again, I think it was a kind of a very provocative dialogue that they had this morning, and I'd like to see some of the panelists, when you heard it yourself, did any thoughts come into your mind in terms of this balance of the open source versus the commercial off the shelf, and any other ideas there in terms of that solution space? Dan, you want to go first, or go ahead?
Yeah. So I mean, whether it's the government or even with again back at the Skybox days, I mean, what we typically do is look at an open source solution first to determine whether its functionality meets our needs. Whether the cost of sort of maintaining the open source version may be more expensive than working with the COTS vendor. And if the open source solution will work for us, then that's the solution we adopted. In some cases, there weren't open source solutions to the problems to the specific functionality we were looking for. And so then we would go to a COTS solution, and then in the rare instance that there was neither an open source solution nor a COTS solution, then we would develop it ourselves. But that's what we would do, at least, is weigh the balance between those and make the appropriate decision.
Mel?
I guess the thought that comes to mind is Mr. Peterson's issue that he described about, the vendor that they had this, they thought they had a long-term agreement with them that didn't turn out to be that way. If you start down a path like that, that you always have to have a plan B ready to go, so that you incentivize them to continue to stay with the agreement that you made with them, as opposed to you getting stuck with whatever they decide has to go because they know you have no alternative. It's kind of like owning a building and like we have at Aerospace that we have paid for about 3 times now with the modifications that we've made, but not having an alternative. And so we're trying to create an alternative so that there's at least a possibility that if things don't go the way that you want it to, as the person that's responsible for acquiring it, you can break a relationship that's where somebody has changed their position on it.
Very good. Dan?
I use a phrase at our office saying, let's show me the architecture diagram, and I want to assume no single point of stability, which sounds terrible. But the point is, you should be able to point to any of those tools or anything on there. If something happens, the company gets acquired, the license agreement goes through the roof, you need to have a plan B. I flew out to Palo Alto a number of years ago and met with chief of engineering for a big middleware company that wanted our business. They went through their pitch and how unique they were. I said, well, for what we're looking at, that causes me some problems. They said, what do you mean? We're the best. We are the only ones that do all these things. I said, well, consider your product if you can convince me I don't have to have your product. They had never received that question from anybody, and this was their chief engineer. And it made them start thinking different, because I said, I can't commit to your product if by definition, with all the uniqueness, you're going to lock me into things. So I think it's an important approach, and now we deal with vendors differently that way. We want to look for that. As far as COTS versus homegrown, Goddard used to have a very strong planning and scheduling system. The whole team of support people. Because we had enough new missions, the new missions are always the ones funding the ongoing sustainment. We went through a few years where we had a lot of big missions on orbit, but no big missions in development. The team went to zero, the people went elsewhere, 100% loss of the capability, and we had to dead end the products. I cannot afford to maintain all our in-house products. So COTS to me helps save that. That puts the burden on them, and they can share the leverage across all their customer base. We do have a make-buy document, for the acquisition process. I've redlined it saying we're missing a step because it has been see if you have something already that can do the job. Then you make your choice. What would it cost you to build it? What would it cost to COTS? But what they left out is at NASA, again, with 10 centers with lots of software, there is no step that says go look elsewhere within your community for available software. That step's missing in our process. And I think, we all have good tools, and sometimes, across the Air Force or across NASA, there's that extra step we could look at and collaborate a little more for some of these products.
Miguel, how do you make those type of decisions at Eutelsat in terms of open source versus COTS versus homegrown?
It's easy because we just don't pay licenses. So whenever we are in a situation where maybe a given license or product or COTS is of interest, we need to ask the contractor to open that system to us. So to some extent, that is making that system open source to us. Otherwise, we don't go with that, because that creates a dependability that over the long term is not effective. I remember some days ago, a contractor was telling me that actually my license was not bought, but was rented, and that the rental was going to end in 1 year or so. Say, what is this? No, and because it's a rental that was inherited from an old system, then if you don't renew, the system stops. So I say, sorry, this is completely unacceptable. And these are situations that may happen, so we try to avoid them. And that's it. Thank you.
So we're getting near the end. We have a little bit of time left. I'd like to end with one final question for our panelists. I mean, all of you have been, very involved in terms of space assets and ground systems and, everything that goes into it. And so we're in the year 2015. We're in our 19th year of GSAW. If we kind of move forward, say, to 2030, which is, say, 15 years from now, in your mind, as you think toward 2030, 15 years from now, what would be your vision in terms of something you might see that would be different in terms of space assets and their operations that we either aren't seeing now or that we'd be seeing more of? So what would be that vision that you would put out there? And especially if you got that chance to be that ruthless leader, what would be that vision that you'd put out there? So why don't we start here, John, with you?
I get put on the spot first. Okay. I think my perspective is a bit different than everyone else's on the panel based on my background, right? So when I think of what we're going to see in the sort of the CubeSat area, because that's where I'm most familiar with, 15, 20 years out, right? What I see is a substantial, obviously, reduction in size, increase in capability. But in order to achieve a lot of this on the budgets that CubeSats have, it's going to have to be largely automated. So we're going to go from systems now that require, somewhat, I'd say, moderate human-in-the-loop operation, especially compared to the big satellites, right? We don't have as many humans in the loop as the big satellites, to circumstances where we have almost no humans in the loop, where we'll be able to have satellites that are pre-built, ready to deploy, ready to integrate into the launch vehicle on the shelf before we know what their missions are, right? And we'll be able to launch them, we'll be able to customize them, and then the ground support will be universal for all the satellites, and it's all going to be largely automated. And that's sort of where I see the CubeSats, and it may not even take 15 years to get there. But that's the direction I see at least the really small CubeSats going in.
Yeah, great.
And their ground station infrastructure with it.
Thanks. Now.
Well, I think there will always be a need for some big, Battlestar Galactica satellites, because there's some capabilities that you can only do that way. But I think that there will be a large population of small satellites, CubeSats, and actually in 15 years I would guess that some of your students would be actually controlling it from their dorm room. Okay? See, they already do. Over their iPhone. Yes. Or it'll be the iPhone 200 or something,
iPhone 200, right.
by then. But I think that I am hopeful that the cyber threat that we all worry about will be solved some way. I don't know what the solution is, but in 15 years I hope that we will have solved it so that we can, in fact, have confidence that when we send some place or someone a message, that we have confidence that they're getting the message, that it wasn't taken and used for some nefarious purpose, and that they have confidence that they know who sent it. So that that's where I hope we are in 15 years. I don't know, because there's no solution yet. I don't know if we'll get there.
That's a grand vision, though. It's very good. Matt?
Yeah, so I get to go third and echo everyone else's comments. I feel bad for the last panelist. So our flight operators are already storyboarding how they will be playing volleyball and resolving anomalies on their iPads when they come in. So that's what we're working towards. I guess one of the things, so clearly there will be more spacecraft on orbit that especially in Silicon Valley, even that space is sort of very hot right now with tons of money being poured in. Google recently invested $1 billion in SpaceX, bought us for $500 million. So clearly there's money behind that in some of the new technology companies. One of the things that was talked about yesterday during the SmallSat workshop, which is a little bit different, would be the idea of having ground stations that are more accessible, that are not owned just by, say, Google or NASA or whatnot, and having interfaces where those ground stations publish their availability. The different people who'd like to use that ground station can bid for the capacity there, and then those bids are automatically resolved, and that ground station can be used. So I wish I could take credit for that idea, but that's at least something that could happen in 20 to 30 years. I know Dan said that would never happen with some of the government assets, so maybe it won't, but at least the possibility of that happening in the commercial space, that's possible there.
Very good. Thank you. Frank?
Okay. If you notice the trend that's occurring in the last 10 years is towards commoditization. And I think you're going to see that trend occur in the space area, too. In-Q-Tel is actually going onto CubeSats now, and they're going to do more commercial stuff. So I think you're going to see something that Matt talked about. You're going to see cloud computing environments that are ground stations, and you're going to just log in and figure out what you want to do. I think the commoditization is going to take over everything. Between the drones occurring all over the place and the CubeSats, the environment above us is going to be full of stuff. And the question is how you're going to control it. That's the FAA issue. But I think that's the trend, and we're going to get to that point pretty quickly, because obviously we all like data, and we like data all over the place, and we may just have government centers for commoditization as well as commercial centers for commoditization. But since the trend right now is to move all our apps either way, I think you're going to see everything moved either way also, and it depends on what assets you have in the sky as to which center you're going to go to.
Great. Thank you. Dan?
First, how many people here are planning to not be at GSAW 2030 to see if our answers are correct? Therefore,
You can say whatever you want.
we can say just about anything. But what that points out is, we need to get the new, fresh folks in that are going to take over and be at the GSAW 2030 and rely on them for a lot of this change. But a couple things. There's a lot of work being done now on the communications assets and what's available for the spacecraft. If we could have continual access anytime we want it, on-demand access in the future, not go through, we have some cases a 3-week scheduling process because I want to talk to the spacecraft for 10 minutes when it's over a given station. Holy smokes. As the volumes go up and the needs go up, we need to have on-demand data access. Once you have that, why doesn't your spacecraft operate itself? We're working with a university that says they want a zero footprint and almost a zero existence control center. Anything they need to write for control center capabilities, they're going to put on board. All the data conversions, all the alerting, and they'll use a smartphone, and the satellite will just call if there's a problem. And there may be stuff you need to do, but in general, it has a job to do. Collect data, report the data out, make sure things are being done cleanly. It knows enough to, redundant devices, whatever, to switch things over if it needs to. And it knows who to call if there's a problem. I mean, why? So there's those kind of concepts. We're looking at control centers. The control center is like a conference room. Conference room might have a projector. Ours might have some big screens, software-defined networking, and cloud-based software. So why not sign up for a control center room once a week for your team so they all get together? Other than that, They're working in their office. And when you go into that room, you flip a switch or you type something in, the networks and security get configured for your mission. The software from the cloud is what shows up on the screens. You know, the idea that we need physical control centers all the time. 30 missions should not need 30 control centers, you know, physical sessions. So I think there'll be a lot of change. If you look at what the airline industry does, apparently if a 777 is flying cross country and figures out it has a problem, it'll go ahead and order up the parts, have them flown into Dulles from another airport, and have them there waiting when it gets there. You know, that's smarts on the vehicle, and you know, there's still ways we can step it up to that level.
Thank you. Miguel.
Very difficult issue. Normally, when I try to envisage what or how will be the future, I look at my kids. I mean, how they do. For instance, my kids, they don't use the email address. Okay? And then when they have something to tell to each other, they will send a picture, not a message. I don't know if they will attend workshops. Maybe that's going to be difficult. And they find easy, and it has to be everywhere, possibility to connect and to exchange. I mean, for instance, we have been traveling in Asia recently, and they find, of course, unacceptable if the hotel is not providing Wi-Fi access, right? So for sure that, and with regards to communication satellites, that is my business, to me is going to be a very high demand for information. I mean, and that's going to increase over the years. It's going to be so enormous that I don't think the systems or the design we do today for the systems is going to be good enough. I believe that future systems will have to be much more selective on the information they transmit to other systems. For instance, today a communication satellite is going to, and even with new generations this is increasing over the time, is going to send to ground almost the status of all the parameters all the time. So that's a very high throughput of data. And then, of course, that enforces you at the ground systems to process all that information. I think it will be much more clever that the satellite informs whenever it has a problem, and that just sends down that information. And in the same sense, for many other systems. So I think that the subsystems will have to be much more clever than today, and to transmit information that is providing some information that is useful. So that results in the design of systems that are more intelligent itself, each one of them independently, and then less need to transfer information that is useless. So I think that maybe this will be a tendency over the next year. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you.
One real quick one. The other thing that may happen in 15 years at GSAW is you'll have a speaker get up and talk about this idea for a great enterprise system that they've been thinking of. They've prototyped it now for 25 years, and they're about ready to implement it.
Okay, with that, I want to thank our panelists very much for coming and giving us a very entertaining morning. Yep. Oh, we have certificates for everybody. Yes, absolutely. So we will pass these out, and we're going to be going to break for 15 minutes, and then when we come back at 11, we will have our very exciting wrap-up of all the summary sessions. You only got to go to one working group, so now is your chance to hear about what each of the working groups did. So, very good. Thank you, everybody. Dr. Gallardo.